Most people think that finding a renal transplant in their abdominal short case is the destination. They've clinched the diagnosis, they've passed the short case, time to celebrate. But the truth is that finding that renal transplant is merely a starting point. And to do well in this short case, you're gonna have to dig so much deeper. Today, I'm gonna show you how to get top marks in your renal transplant short case using something I'm calling the short case curiosity method. The renal transplant short case is a bit of a gift on exam day, but only if you know how to unpack it. The truth is, your examiners fully expect you to find that transplant kidney. They see that as extremely basic. They don't just want to know that the transplant is there, they want to know what caused the renal failure, how well is the transplant working, are there any medication side effects from those immunosuppressants, and clues to all of these things are available on examination. And so if you want to know what to do in your short case after you find that transplant kidney, you are in the right place. But before we get into the specifics of the renal transplant short case, first let me share with you a framework that I created to help you with every single short case in your exams. And we're calling this framework the short case curiosity method. And once you learn this framework, we'll go ahead and apply it to our renal transplant short case. And if you are studying for your clinical exam, I have some incredible free exam resources for you. Be sure to stick around until the end so I can tell you how to get your hands on those. You're gonna need them. So the short case curiosity method. The key word here is curiosity, because curiosity is a state of being and it does two things. Firstly, staying curious helps you to look for clues without jumping to conclusions, so you can stay open and find all the puzzle pieces and see how they all fit together for maximum exam points. And the second thing curiosity does is it soothes your nervous system and allows you to stay present in order to find those clues. Think about it, right? Being in a state of curiosity is literally incompatible with fight or flight. We don't run away from a saber-toothed tiger thinking curious thoughts. Oh, I wonder what its name is. How did it get there? Is there a zoo here? No. We're in survival mode and parts of our brain literally shut down during fight or flight. And so being in a state of curiosity helps us to stay open and present so that we're able to look for the clues, remember them, and put them all together. And curiosity has two elements. It's a feeling, a state of being that we get ourselves into, and it's a behavior, right? Asking questions and finding the answers. Well, that's all very well, Christine, but I'm dead nervous, so how do I get myself into curiosity mode? And a little hack that I really think works for this, and what I want you to do as you practice your short cases, is to find an affirmation that works for you. Something emotionally neutral I find that works is, I enjoy solving puzzles, or I'm excited to solve this puzzle. Whichever feels true and good to you. So find your sentence, say it often, and train yourself to get in the habit of saying this before every single short case. And once you get yourself into curious mode, next comes the questions. What, why, how bad, and what next? Let me explain. What refers to the diagnosis, doing your systems exam, finding the clinical signs, and putting this together. Why is about looking for the cause or a risk factor for what you just found. How bad? How severe is the problem? What complications are there of this condition? And what next is what you would look for next on examination and also during your investigative approach, right? The examination, you might go ahead and do it if you have time, but otherwise this is something you will end up discussing with the examiners together with that investigative approach. So that's the framework. Lock that in for me, because now we'll be putting that into action as we work through our renal transplant short case. And you'll see very soon how this easily allows you to think through any short case, but also helps you to present it back to the examiners. So step one is what? Our diagnosis and differentials. This is about arriving at our basic diagnosis that there is indeed a renal transplant here. A typical renal transplant case in your exam would usually encourage you to start in the abdomen and proceed, and so we'll use the abdomen as our starting point today for the purpose of this video. But of course, with every short case, you're going to start with general inspection, so you might find a few clues ahead of time. For example, you might see a big massive fistula in their arm, which does make you pose the question, I wonder if there's a transplant there, or could this person have polycystic kidneys or polycystic liver, right? So you might have an inclination before you get to the abdomen. But once you've done your general inspection, you're going to move on to the abdominal exam, and before palpating, you'll notice if there are any scars, right? In a straightforward case, a renal transplant would typically coincide with a right or left iliac fossa scar, and the transplant kidney is immediately palpable below that. Although adiposity can make this difficult in some patients and the scar tends to heal really well, it might be barely visible. And as with any abdominal mass, you'll want to outline it as best you can, make sure you can get above it to delineate it from a spleen or a liver, depending on what side the transplant kidney is on. And when you percuss the transplant kidney, it will be dull to percussion because it's right under your hand. And if you do think it's a kidney transplant, be sure to check for graft tenderness by palpating the graft whilst looking at the patient's face for any wincing or signs of pain. Graft tenderness would suggest infection or rejection. And then we want to listen over the renal artery for any brie, which could suggest renal artery stenosis. And whilst you're at the abdomen, make sure to have a look for previous or current peritoneal dialysis access points. And at this point, we really need to discuss some plot twists to be aware of. So the first is the kidney pancreas transplant. These are done via a midline laparotomy scar. So you'll expect to find a midline scar instead of an iliac fossa scar in those cases. And the second thing to be aware of is that it's possible to have more than one transplant kidney in situ, an old one and a new one, or they may have had a previous kidney transplant that's now been removed. So just because there's a scar doesn't mean there's a kidney underneath it, and so make sure that you can feel that kidney before saying it's there. Now, of course, the last thing that I want to do is to set up a cognitive bias here. Those are just some of the clues that go along with the renal transplant, but there are many different reasons to have an iliac fossa scar, right? So keep an open mind, but if you do think that you have found a renal transplant, then take note of everything we just mentioned in the abdomen, and now we continue with our curiosity framework to make sure that we do not miss a trick. So now we're on to step 2. The why, right? Once you've found the transplant, we have the what, now we ask, why is it there? Can we find a cause of this end-stage renal failure or risk factors for CKD on examination? Make sure to look for polycystic kidney disease, looking for enlarged palpable kidneys or liver cysts. Did you palpate these already on the abdominal exam? And be aware that sometimes a polycystic kidney is removed to make room for the transplant on that same side. So you may or may not feel the polycystic kidney on both sides, and if you are concerned about this, a key clue is to look for a native kidney nephrectomy scar on the patient's back. So feel free to roll them over or sit them up at some point so you can look on the back for a nephrectomy scar in those cases where you can't quite feel the polycystic kidney on that side and you're wondering if it went somewhere. Now, heading away from the abdomen, consider, are there any clues for diabetes? Maybe a continuous glucose monitor patch, injection sites, a BSL monitor at the bedside, evidence of finger prick testing. Next, we want to look for hypertension. This is both a cause and a complication of CKD, and so it's very important as part of the renal short case. So we must measure the blood pressure, but before you do this, you're going to have to make sure that you do this in a non-fistula arm. So have a look at both arms. Look for scars from previous inactive fistulas and run your hand down the arm to feel for any thrill that suggests there is a current active fistula there. And if you do feel a thrill, listen over for a brie to complete the examination of the fistula. Now, sometimes you can have a fistula that's made from graft material, like plastic material, and be aware that that does not have a thrill, but it will have a brie when you listen over. So that's not common, but just so you know about it. And if you have any doubt as to whether there's an active fistula or not that you need to avoid, just turn to the examiners and ask if it's safe to perform a blood pressure in the arm that you'd like to do the blood pressure in, and they'll tell you yes or no. You can measure blood pressure over an old fistula that's not functional, that's fine. Now make a note of the blood pressure, speak it out loud to the examiner so they don't miss it, and remember that hypertension can be a cause or a complication of CKD, and it can also be a side effect of transplant medications, which we'll come back to in just a tick. And lastly, peripheral vascular disease is a risk factor for renal vascular disease, right? If you got time, do a carotid examination and do the peripheral pulses, or say that you would like to examine the pulses. And of course, this is not an exhaustive list of things that can cause renal impairment. You might also consider connective tissue disease, which might put someone at risk of GN. But honestly, most people with GN don't have a lot of clinical signs of GN, right? It's more a silent disease that shows up on bloods and urine tests. So by all means, have a quick squiz for vasculitic rash or other features of connective tissue disease like lupus, but honestly, you're not likely to find those in this short case. So if they're not obvious, don't linger there, right? We need to move on. And similarly, if you see a patient with hearing aids, you might think of Alport syndrome as a cause of their end-stage renal failure, but there are also lots of reasons that someone could have a hearing aid. So make a note of it, make a clever comment about it in your future, but don't jump to conclusions with this. Okay, so now you've considered the why behind the renal transplant with some of the common potential causes of end-stage renal failure. The next step is how bad. But before we jump into that, be sure to hit that like and subscribe button for more high-yield exam topics just like this one. Now, coming on to the how bad question in our framework, this is where we consider severity and complications. In this case of renal transplant, we want to consider two key things: the graft function and the side effects of the immunosuppression. For graft function, how well is this kidney actually working, right? And we can explore this on examination. Here we're checking for complications of CKD: fluid overload, edema, JVP, chest auscultation, hypertension, we've already done the blood pressure, anemia or pallor, asterixis or flap, which suggests uremic encephalopathy, a pericardial rub, suggesting uremic pericarditis, you'd hope not on exam day, peripheral neuropathy in the lower limbs, examine that if you're winning, this can be a complication of end-stage renal failure, various drugs, and also diabetes. But otherwise, you could keep the peripheral neuropathy for something that you would like to examine if you had more time when you're discussing that with the examiners. And also consider here, are they receiving dialysis right now? If they do have a fistula, has it been recently needled? Do they have a PD catheter in situ? Do they have a perm cath in situ? Now be aware that a perm cath can be used for dialysis, but it can also be used for things like plasma exchange if the patient has antibody-mediated rejection. And so you can consider both of those in your thought process in a transplant patient. And along the way, as we do this, we're looking for evidence of medication side effects. We're looking for tremor from tacrolimus, and that can be done just before you examine for a flap. We're looking for gingival hyperplasia from ciclosporin when we're looking at the mouth and the face. We're also looking for hypertrichosis with ciclosporin, but a lot of patients do manage this, so it might not be so visible. With steroids, we're looking for Cushingoid features. Look at the face, look for a buffalo hump, look for thin arms with a round middle, check for proximal weakness in the arms and legs, and look for skin thinning and bruising on exposed areas. And many of the transplant medications lead to diabetes as well. Steroids and tacrolimus are both diabetogenic. So again, we check for diabetes here, right? CGMs, finger pricks, insulin injection sites as a cause of CKD, but also as a complication of these transplant medications. So if you haven't done the diabetes check already in an earlier step, you'll be doing it here. And now that we have considered how bad with the severity of CKD and the complications of immunosuppression, our final step in this process is to consider what next. This part ultimately becomes what you say in response to when the examiners ask you, is there anything else you'd like to look for on examination? And also when they ask you, what investigations would you like to perform? In this case of a renal transplant, you could say lots of awesome things, like I would like to check their temperature and perform a urine dipstick examination. I'd like to review their recent pathology, including their GFR and creatinine trends, as well as other electrolytes, and review their immunosuppressant levels. I'd also like to examine for peripheral neuropathy as a complication of chronic kidney disease. And I'd also like to check the peripheral pulses and examine the carotid arteries, if you haven't already, looking for evidence of peripheral vascular disease. And if someone had evidence of diabetes, you'd say, I'd like to evaluate their glycemic control and examine further for diabetic complications. Or if they don't have obvious diabetes on examination, I'd also like to evaluate their cardiovascular risk factors, in particular looking at their lipid levels and evaluating for diabetes. You catch my drift. Obviously, you're going to have to individualize this to your patient, but doesn't that just sound magic? And so you can see how in doing this renal transplant case together, any renal case is now super easy, right? We can mix and match. If you find polycystic kidneys on examination, your next step will be, can I find a transplant? And if they don't have a transplant, then you will still go through everything that we just mentioned apart from the immunosuppressant side effects. And if you do find a polycystic kidney on exam day, you're going to need to tell it apart from a spleen and a liver for that matter. And so if you are wondering how to do this with absolute ease, then this video has you covered. Go ahead, click that link, and I will see you in there. And because you stayed until the end, I have some freebies for you. I've created a cheat sheet for you using the Curiosity framework so that you can go forth and practice both the renal transplant and polycystic kidney short case, making sure that you tick all the boxes. You can grab your free PDF using the link below. Thank you so much for joining me, Dr. Humans. You got this, and I will see you again very soon. Bye.